series for Making for America 1789 to 1900. This is the final video for the final theme, which is American cultures 1877 to 1900. The first thing we're going to have a look at is the natives between the period 1877 and 1900. We can clearly see as we've gone through the course that the natives' position in society has deteriorated rapidly. Their ability to run as tribes in the conventional way has been removed, starting with things such as the Indian Removal Act and leading up to things like the Homestead Act, which pushed them off the plains as well. So we know that there has been a horrendously negative impact of Americans moving west, and we are now going to look really at the result of that, starting with the destruction of the buffalo. So railroads had seen buffalo hunters emerge. Killing a single buffalo might earn a hunter between $3 and $20 for the cost of a 25-cent cartridge. So it's a real incentive for them to make a lot of money on killing buffalo. This is obviously going to be horrendous for tribes such as the Lakota Sioux, who were nomadic. So by 1880, 16 million kilos of buffalo had been sent east to become fertiliser. So that gives an indication of how many buffalo were being killed. And we can see the statistic there, which is 3 million buffalo were killed by hunters alone. We then have reservations. We spoke about reservations in the last video. These are areas where natives were forced into, so small areas, and they were given rations in these areas. Cattle ranchers fenced in their land, which stopped the nomadic lifestyle of many tribes, and homesteaders on the plains fenced in their water supplies, which stopped the Indians being able to roam freely on their horses. And we also had wild foods such as berries, which were picked and sent to large western cities to be canned, reducing the amount of food available for the natives. So the fact that they were being pushed into these small areas, the fact that the settlers were fencing in their land and their water, and the fact that white Americans were also picking lots of the food which grew on the plains is all going to affect the life of the natives. We then have splitting up tribes. So tribes that were very powerful, such as the Lakota Sioux, were split up. They were confined to reservations. The Sioux, for example, were divided over 5 reservations. The hope was that if they were split up, they were less likely to rebel or to fight against the US government. So many of the native tribes were split up. Farming and rations. Reservations forced many natives to become farmers. They weren't naturally farmers. It wasn't something that they had practiced before, but they have to do this because they are confined to these small areas. Hunting outside of the reservation was banned, so tribes had to rely on growing crops such as squash and corn. These crops often struggled due to the quality of soil on the plains. We've referenced that before. Remember, there were the locusts as well that would eat away crops. There was the extreme heat in the summer, so this wasn't a natural place to farm anyway. Many reservation Indians therefore had to rely on beef rations to survive, which came from the US government. It was often very poor quality, and there wasn't enough of it. There was also forced assimilation. We spoke about assimilation when we looked at the West, 1839 to 1860, so the second topic within the course. Assimilation means, remember, natives trying to almost accept white American culture, make that part of their culture. So there was still a belief that if the natives did this, perhaps the US government would leave them alone. So as a result of this forced assimilation, so this wasn't a choice, Plains Indians were encouraged to live in houses, not teepees, which remember were those tent-like structures which were made from the hides of the buffalo. They were forced to convert to Christianity, or they could face arrest and imprisonment, and some children were sent to boarding schools. They had to learn English, they had to dress like Victorian children, and they also had to change their name to Christian names. Finally, there was the Dawes Act of 1887. This offered individual natives 160 acres of land and full citizenship if they gave up their right to hold land as part of a tribe. So this might potentially look quite attractive, but it was all about breaking up tribes. So any natives that took this may have taken it kind of just instantly thinking that they were going to have their own land, but their right to hold land as part of a tribe disappears, and this enables the US government to take nearly 2/3 of the land the natives had held in 1877 by 1900. So their cultural identity is vastly disappearing, and as a result of this, we see something introduced by the natives which is called the ghost dance, and this was a real sign of desperation from the natives. This was a belief where many native tribes thought if they danced and prayed hard enough, a saviour would come and remove white settlers and fill the plains with buffalo once again. So this really does indicate the desperation that the natives face. So all of this is important for the exam. It's important to know the way life deteriorated for the natives in the last section of our course. Okay, African Americans, economic, social and political changes, 1877 to 1900. You can see from the number of arrows on this slide, there is a lot of information that's going to come to you. I've broken this down into the 3 sections that are in the middle, and I've also colour-coded them for you, so that should help as we go through. So in terms of economics then, first of all, African Americans were legally free as a result of the 13th Amendment, remember, but they were often trapped in low-paid work. So even in the North, where they were generally treated better, they had low-paid work. And in the South, remember, a large number ended up as sharecroppers. So remember, working on white land, giving 2/3 of their crops as rent, very, very similar really to slavery. And this land was often owned by former slaveholders, so very, very similar. So economically, African Americans weren't doing too well in this period. However, those that chose to move west did have more opportunities. So I said to you in the last video that the Homestead Act was also available for African Americans to take up. So remember, the Homestead Act, passed by Lincoln in 1862, had promised 160 acres of land to people who promised to farm the land for 5 years and to pay a small fee. Benjamin Singleton was the person who encouraged African Americans to take this opportunity. Those who followed him to Kansas were known as the Exodusters. I've made that bold for you on the slide, so that's an important name. These Exodusters took an opportunity that was there for them, and 6,000 of them claimed their own homesteads, which, remember, means they claimed their own land. They became farmers. So they did have an opportunity to establish themselves as farmers. So economically, in that sense, if you moved west, you had more of an opportunity to succeed. We also have many African Americans left the southern states to find work in the industrial north. It's understandable that they would have wanted to leave the south with their memories of slavery anyway, but many thought that they would have more of a chance to gain a career in the north, but this was unsuccessful. Due to racist policies, really. Even if African Americans were more educated than their white counterparts, the white man was always more likely to get the job. So there is clearly racism in the north as well as the south, and economically, in industrial cities, African Americans didn't particularly prosper. So their best chance, really, of making money was to move to the west. We do have examples, though, of improving situations in terms of education for African Americans. So Booker T. Washington established schools for African Americans, so to try and improve their literacy rates, to give them a chance to get better jobs. He also established the National Negro Business League to help support black businesses. So obviously Negro, not a term that would be at all acceptable today. However, that was the name of the business league, so it is fine to get into your exam paper just to say that black businesses were being encouraged by people such as Washington. So schools and business support helped improve confidence and jobs, and you've got some statistics there on the slide for how successful policies such as these were. So, for example, 20,000 black teachers. So we can clearly see that education was improving for African Americans. So that, along with moving west, was quite successful. Although the numbers aren't massive for African Americans who managed to get careers, it was on the increase. It was certainly an improvement to what had gone before. Okay, socially. Sadly, then, we see a return of racial segregation. So we'd seen in the previous topic something called the Black Codes. By 1890, these have basically evolved into something called the Jim Crow laws. They are racial segregation laws, and they separated black and white Americans on trains, in theatres, in schools. And in 1896, the Supreme Court declared this legal despite the 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment had said that all people who had been born in America were citizens, were protected by the law. Despite this amendment, the Jim Crow laws are allowed to go ahead. So segregation clearly racist policies towards African Americans. Something that forms really as a result of this segregation are black churches. So by 1900 there were 26 black bishops. Black churches were extremely popular, and these African Americans who were facing this extreme racial segregation were given hope by attending worship. We then have living conditions. Even in the north, racist landlords resulted in poor quality housing. So African Americans did not live in comfortable housing either in the north or the south. Remember, if they are a sharecropper, their housing is generally cramped, poor conditions, and that clearly is the same in the north as well. Okay, politically then, we have something called Redeemer governments. These were southern governments that were dominated by ex-slaveholders. So obviously they are going to be racist against African Americans as well. And these Redeemer governments introduced laws which limited the rights of African Americans, for example, literacy tests for voting. So we did say that education, in terms of education, there were more opportunities for African Americans to learn to read and write, but many were still illiterate. And the Redeemer governments know this, and it helps to limit the political voice that African Americans have by saying that you must take a literacy test in order to vote, because they knew that many wouldn't pass that test. We then have the KKK, who we mentioned again previously. So they have reformed again by the 1890s. So the Ku Klux Klan, remember this extreme right-wing racist group, they remain a powerful influence in the South. Lynching, which is the capture and the hanging of African Americans in public, quite often off trees, as the bodies were left to hang for people to look at. Lynching was far too common for African Americans. So in 1892 alone, 161 African Americans were lynched, and victims were often tortured as well before being murdered. So appalling practices that were carried on by the KKK, and this was not stopped by the government. So clearly in the South, the position for African Americans is not positive at all. We also have constitutional changes. So although the South continued to ignore the rights of African Americans, the amendments to the Constitution, remember the 13th Amendment, which had banned slavery, the 14th Amendment, which had made them citizens and protected by the law, and the 15th Amendment, which had given them the right to vote, those amendments do allow African Americans to campaign for equality. So as much as their position in society is not good by 1900, they have started to campaign for more social equality. Okay, big business, 1877 to 1900. First of all, we have something called corporations. These are much larger than traditional businesses and were run by a president and a board of shareholders rather than a single person or a family. So corporations came to dominate American industry, and I've given you an example on the slide of Andrew Carnegie. He owned the United States Steel Corporation, which was worth over $1 billion. So these corporations were replacing traditional businesses, and they were making lots and lots of money. We also have the growth of the cotton and the tobacco factories. So cotton mills doubled between 1880 and 1900. Cotton mills are not the same as plantations. So cotton mills helped produce cotton. There is no link at all to slavery here. Please do not write slavery in the exam if you are given the dates 1877 to 1900 in a question. Slavery, remember, was banned as a result of the 13th Amendment in 1865. So please do not mention slavery. But these cotton mills doubled the production of cotton between 1880 and 1900, and increased production actually pushes prices down. So this makes cotton more attractive again as a commodity, something that people want to buy, and it helps to make more money. By 1904, the American Tobacco Company controlled 90% of cigarette and 75% of tobacco production. Jobs in these industries for workers were low skilled and poorly paid, but the tobacco company were making lots of profits. We then have fossil fuels and mineral extraction. So growth of factories and railroads had led to an increased demand in resources like coal and iron to build the factories and the railroads. Huge mining operations began. This resulted in huge ecological damage. So huge areas of forest were cut down and toxic chemicals leaked into the water supplies. So very, very similar really to the gold extraction and the quartz in the mountainside that we looked at when we looked at the Californian gold rush. So the fossil fuel removal caused huge negative impacts to the environment. We also have the discovery of copper, tin, lead and silver, which led to big companies such as Anaconda in the West. In Montana, $1 million of copper and silver were being extracted every month, which was vital in cables and conductors for big businesses. So these businesses that managed to get their hands on these minerals, they were making a fortune. The workers themselves, however, were treated very poorly. The temperatures were very high in the mines. There were often mines that collapsed, so people lost their lives. So this was really an example of big business exploiting their workers, using their workers to make them the most money. We then have bonanza farms and cattle ranches. So a bonanza farm were about 10,000 acres in size. They employed 250 workers who were paid low wages. So once again, the owner of the bonanza farm was going to be making all the profits. They made it almost impossible for smaller farmers to survive. So many small farmers, as a result, gave up and moved to cities. So these bonanza farms, these huge farms, see kind of the loss really of small farms. We then have bonanza cattle ranches as well. They were able to survive the fall in prices when there was an oversupply of cattle in 1886. And when they managed to survive this, they bought up the smaller ranches who didn't survive. So both farming and ranching forced many natives off the land into reservations and used up huge amounts of natural resources such as water supplies. So the big businesses on the plains, such as the bonanza cattle ranches, they meant that the natives again were forced off and they again benefited massively. So they were the people who made the money, the people that own these bonanza farms and the ones that owned these bonanza cattle ranches. Okay, the growth and impact of cities, 1877 to 1900. Chicago is a good example to speak about in the exam. So by 1833, Chicago had 200 inhabitants. By 1870, it had 300,000 inhabitants. And by 1900, it had over 1.5 million inhabitants. So that really shows you how cities were growing and expanding within this time period. So cities, like Chicago, had been growing since the late 18th century, so the late 1700s. In 1870, there had been 14 cities with populations over 100,000. By 1900, there were 38. So that is a massive increase again. So we knew New York and Washington on the East Coast as examples of cities that you could reference in the exam that had grown. The impact of these cities then. So there was the invention of the elevator and the skyscraper, which led to an increased demand in iron, steel, coal and copper, so those minerals that we spoke about on the previous slide, and many other resources. Cities also created many new jobs in construction, but also in manufacturing and transport. So if we're thinking of the impact of cities, the demand for those minerals, which caused ecological damage, and also the opportunity, perhaps, for workers to start working in new industries. Workers or migrants, so people that moved to work in the cities, lived poorly. They lived in poorly designed, overcrowded apartments. There was little privacy and sanitation was poor. The death rates of children was also far higher in the cities than for the population as a whole. So you weren't going to live a healthy lifestyle if you moved to one of the big cities. However, there were benefits to living in cities. These include theatres, public parks, political rallies, so being able to have your voice heard, public education. It all created more freedom and opportunity. And by 1900, almost 70% of children attended school. That is a huge increase from what we saw towards the start of this particular time period. Women also had greater freedoms and began their campaign to be allowed to vote. So negatives in terms of the kind of living conditions, but there were benefits to moving to the cities, and not dissimilar really if you think of reasons why people move to London today. So it's always going to cost you a lot of money to move to London, but there are a lot of benefits living there. That was exactly the same back here. We see people living in poor conditions but wanting to have the lifestyle of living in one of the big cities such as Chicago or New York. Okay, we then have mass immigration, 1877 to 1900. So remember, we've spoken about migration or migrants being people within America moving often from east to west. Immigration are external people to America moving into the United States. So there was a surge in immigration to the US by 1900 due to the idea of the American dream. So lower fares on the new steam-powered boats also made the journey more affordable for families overseas. So in the 1890s, 600,000 immigrants came from Italy alone, and that really is proof of this American dream, where life is great in America. There are all these freedoms and benefits of moving to the United States. Becomes a popular idea, and we can clearly see that from the statistic of Italians moving to the United States. Due to the amount of immigrants in the US, the government established their main immigration station at Ellis Island in New York City. This is where you are checked to see whether you have diseases, where your paperwork is checked. So they have to have a station where people are checked when they come into the country, because the numbers now are so vast. So this needs to be a more organised system. Unfortunately, these immigrants weren't always met in a friendly manner. So there were cities that had anti-immigration violence. This was mainly due to immigrants being offered lower wages to work. So some white workers felt they were being pushed out of jobs and that immigrants were going to replace them. Immigrants also sometimes face prejudice because of their different cultural beliefs. So we can clearly see this in something that was set up in 1887, which was called the American Protective Association. It was set up to protect, this is in inverted commas, because obviously there was no need for this association, but it was set up to protect Protestant Americans from the dangers of the Catholic, Jewish and Buddhist immigrants. So clearly we can see that many white Americans had a fear of people entering America who were immigrants. This is very ironic considering that all white Americans were immigrants. Remember, the natives were the indigenous people, but despite this, 1877 to 1900, we see prejudice from the white Americans that have been living there for a while now to anybody new that comes into the country. Unfortunately as well, we have extreme prejudice and dislike of Chinese immigrants. So in the 1870s, there were anti-Chinese riots which led to many murders, and parts of Tacoma, which was in Washington, being burnt to the ground. In 1882, the US government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which limited the number of Chinese workers entering America. So again, we see a complete exploitation of the Chinese when Americans need them. So for example, when the railroad was being constructed, and we saw the 12,000 Chinese workers helping to build that railroad, we see that they're allowed, but now in the 1870s, the US government start to limit the numbers that come into the country. So we can see a change that has happened by this point in American history. Okay, that is the final part of the course. We're going to end this video the same as we've ended the others. I'd like you to test yourself, please. There are 6 questions on topics that we've just been through. If you pause the video now, answer the questions, and then replay when you want me to go through the answers with you. Okay, number 1, what was a reservation and which ethnic group did they impact? So a reservation, remember, was a small area of land where natives were confined to. They were encouraged to farm and they often had to rely on rations. So this is the Native Americans that the reservations affected. Now, 2 ways that the US government tried to force natives to assimilate. Again, there were a long list. So we have encouraged to live in houses, not teepees. Conversion to Christianity or face arrest and imprisonment, sent to boarding schools, learn English, wear Victorian clothing and change their names to Christian names. Number 3, who were the Exodusters? These were the African Americans who followed Benjamin Singleton to Kansas to claim their land from the Homestead Act. Remember, the Homestead Act passed in 1862, 160 acres of land for a small fee, was not only limited to white people. African Americans could claim this as well, but many hadn't up until this point. So Benjamin Singleton encouraged the Exodusters to do that. Number 4, what were the Jim Crow laws? Remember, I said they were quite similar to the Black Codes, but these were in the 1890s. They were racial segregation laws. They separated black and white Americans on trains, in theatres and in schools. In 1896, the Supreme Court declared this legal, despite the 14th Amendment, which, remember, had made all people born in the US citizens of the United States and protected by the law. Number 5, how did Bonanza Farms affect smaller farmers? Remember, these were these large farms, 10,000 acres in size. They employed 250 workers who were paid low wages. They made it almost impossible for small farmers to survive. So many small farmers, remember, gave up and moved to cities. Excuse me. Number 6, which immigrants arguably faced the worst treatment in America and how? We spoke about the fact that this was the Chinese workers, so there were anti-Chinese riots, and we spoke about the Exclusion Act, which limited the number of Chinese workers entering America. Okay, so that is Making of America. So they are the 5 topics. Please keep going through these videos, use them as much as you want to, as much as they are useful, and that is the last part of this course. So thank you for watching.